Have you ever wondered how close we've come to the brink of nuclear war? Let's journey back to the year 1962, a year etched in history as the stage of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was a time when political tension was at its zenith, a time when two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood glaring at each other, each waiting for the other to blink, each ready to push the button that could end life as we know it. The Cold War era was not just a clash of ideologies but a chess game of power, influence and intimidation. The world, as a spectator, watched with bated breath as these two giants danced around the threat of nuclear war, a war that could turn our blue planet into a desolate wasteland. And so, in the midst of this tension, the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded. In the summer of 1962, the Soviet Union began to install nuclear missiles in Cuba. This was not a random act of aggression, but a strategic move in the high-stakes chess game that was the Cold War. The proximity of Cuba to the United States made it a perfect staging ground for these deadly weapons, and the Soviets saw this as an opportunity to tip the balance of power in their favor. Meanwhile, American U-2 spy planes, soaring high above the Caribbean, started picking up unusual activity on the island. Photographs revealed the chilling truth. Missile bases were under construction. The Kennedy administration was taken aback. What was to be done? Should they strike first or seek a diplomatic solution? The debate within the US government was intense, reflecting the gravity of the situation. The choices were stark, and the stakes were high. The world held its breath as the superpowers glared at each other across the Caribbean Sea. What followed was a tense, nerve-wracking standoff between two superpowers. For 13 days in October 1962, the world watched and waited as the US and the Soviet Union stared each other down. The Cuban Missile Crisis had reached a terrifying peak, a showdown of epic proportions. President Kennedy, undeterred by the looming threat, took decisive action. A naval blockade was imposed around Cuba, a clear message that no further missile shipments would be tolerated. This move, however, was not without its risks. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, was quick to fire back a warning. He declared this blockade an act of war, heightening the tension that was already palpable across the globe. The international community was on edge, their eyes trained on these two superpowers, poised for a conflict that could change the world as we knew it. The stakes had never been higher. The fate of the world hung in the balance. Finally, on October 28, 1962, a resolution was reached. In a world teetering on the edge of nuclear annihilation, this day marked a turning point. The United States and the Soviet Union, two superpowers locked in a dangerous dance, found a way to step back from the precipice. The resolution was as dramatic as the crisis itself. An agreement was hammered out in the halls of power. The Soviet Union agreed to remove their missiles from the island of Cuba, those weapons of mass destruction that had cast a long and terrifying shadow over the Western Hemisphere. In return, the United States made a solemn pledge, a promise not to invade Cuba, to respect its sovereignty. It was a delicate balance, a compromise between powers, a deal that held the fate of the world in its hands. And when the agreement was announced, when the missiles began to be dismantled, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in the Cold War. The world had peaked over the precipice of nuclear annihilation and had, understandably, found the view unsettling. This seismic event shook the global community, compelling the two superpowers to reassess their perilous game of brinkmanship. In the crisis's chilling aftermath, there was a palpable shift. The United States and the Soviet Union, recognizing the terrifying potential of their escalating tensions, began to seek ways to prevent such a close brush with catastrophe from happening again. This led to the establishment of a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow, famously known as the Hotline. This wasn't just a telephone line, it was a lifeline, a symbol of a newfound commitment to diplomacy over conflict. The crisis had exposed the fragility of peace in the nuclear age, but it also highlighted humanity's capacity for restraint and dialogue. In the shadow of nuclear annihilation, the world found a way to step back from the brink.